I remember that day like it happened yesterday. The feeling of helplessness, the fear that gripped me, and the memories that still haunt me. My name is Wayne, and this is the story of the day that changed my life forever. It was just an ordinary Thursday. I feel like all disaster stories start like that. But it's true. Everything is calm before the real terror begins. School was as it always was. Full of students running through the hallways, teachers complaining about backpacks left on the floor, and last-minute reminders about homework nobody did. That morning, I woke up late. No time for breakfast, which was nothing new for me. I was a senior, and all I could think about was the day I'd finally get out of that place that felt more like a prison. My first class of the day was math. The class was, as usual, bored out of their minds, and Mr. Collins, our teacher, was scribbling equations on the board, hoping at least one of us was paying attention. I remember the clock on the wall read 8:37 when everything started going wrong. The lights began to flicker, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The familiar sound of the school's PA system broke the silence.
Attention all students and staff. This is a lockdown. I repeat, we are in lockdown. Follow protocol immediately.
My heart started pounding. Lockdown drills were usually just an excuse to waste time, but this felt different. The tone of the voice wasn't the usual. We all just sat there, frozen, waiting for an explanation that never came. Mr. Collins locked the door, pulled down the blinds, and pointed under the desks. He didn't need to say anything. We all knew what it meant. We'd done countless drills, and each of us knew exactly what to do. Now that I think about it, as I'm older, it angers me that half of us didn't know how to solve equations or point out other countries on a map, but we knew exactly what to do in case someone walked into the school with a gun. The fact that this is American reality is the real horror. As I crawled under the desk, I remembered one of the last times Mr. Collins had talked to us about what to do in a real lockdown. He emphasized the importance of staying quiet, not trying to be a hero, and waiting for help to arrive. At the time, it seemed like a joke, something distant. But now, here we were, all crouched down, hearts in our throats, thoughts racing in every direction. Time seemed to stand still. Minutes felt like hours in my mind. The silence was crushing, and my mind started imagining the worst. What was out there? A robber, a shooter. I couldn't stop thinking about the stories I'd seen on the news, of attacks on schools that seemed so far from our reality, but now felt terrifyingly close. The tension in the room was growing by the second. The muffled sound of my classmates' breathing was the only thing breaking the horror of whatever was happening somewhere else. Probably in the next building. Some of us peeked out from under the desks, while others stayed perfectly still, as if afraid to draw the attention of whatever might be out there. I kept my eyes glued to the floor, focused on the linoleum pattern, trying to stay calm. But the adrenaline wouldn't let me. Then we heard someone running down the hallway. Fast, erratic footsteps that stopped abruptly outside our door. The doorknob started rattling, followed by frantic pounding. Someone was trying to get in, and it wasn't an adult. I looked at the door, and through the narrow window, I saw a boy covered in blood. He was banging on the door desperately, eyes wide with fear, like he was running from something. That boy, who I recognized only by face, was now someone I couldn't even recognize. He was shouting, but we couldn't hear anything through the walls. He pounded with his fists, his knuckles turning red, until he gave up and looked behind him, like he was expecting someone. We watched as he ran back down the hallway, tripping over his own feet, disappearing from sight as quickly as he'd appeared. And that's when the fear really set in. This wasn't a drill. It was real. And someone was chasing that boy. And we, to save our own lives, did nothing. No one knew what to do, or if we should do anything. Mr. Collins stayed pressed against the door, his body tense, blocking the entrance. I don't think he even realized that it was a wounded kid on the other side. No one dared move or speak. My mind was trying to process everything that was happening. But the truth was, we were trapped and defenseless. The door separating us from danger seemed incredibly fragile. The minutes that followed were agonizing. The silence was interrupted by sporadic noises in the hallway, as if someone was pacing back and forth. It was like a predator was searching for its next victim, and we were just prey waiting to be found. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet again. The quiet was broken by a knock on our door. It was loud, sharp, and the sound made me jump. All of us looked towards the sound, eyes wide with fear. The doorknob began to turn slowly, as if someone was trying to force it open. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. It was a horrible feeling. That terror of knowing something was right there, on the other side, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Mr. Collins pressed even harder against the door, using his body to reinforce the barrier. The pounding grew more intense, now with a violence that left us all frozen in place. He was straining to keep the door shut, and all I could think was that at any moment it might give way. But luckily, this room had a new security mechanism that few others had. The locks had been reinforced after a recent incident at another school, and at that moment, it felt like a miracle. The man outside kept pounding. We could hear the doorknob creaking, but the door held firm. I closed my eyes and tried to control my breathing. It was like a never-ending nightmare. The pounding stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything went silent again. When I finally dared to open my eyes again, I realized the man had given up. Or maybe he found another target. I hadn't recognized his face, and although he was older than us, I don't know if he was much older. His footsteps faded down the hallway, growing more distant. I didn't know if it was safe to come out, or if the nightmare was still lurking in the shadows. I looked at my classmates. No one moved. We were all frozen in time, trapped by fear. Eventually, the distant sound of sirens filled the air, and for a moment, I felt a mix of relief and dread. The cops were coming. But I knew it was too late for some of my colleagues. The minutes that followed felt endless. The door to our room stayed shut, and we stayed there, waiting, like animals cornered with nowhere to run. When the police finally reached our room, they opened the door slowly. We were all sweaty, trembling, but we were alive. The officers motioned for us to come out, and stepping into the hallway was like walking into a war zone. Shattered glass littered the floor, dried blood stained the walls, and signs of a struggle were everywhere. Some students were found hiding in other rooms. Others weren't so lucky. That day we learned that the man hadn't been caught. He'd slipped away before the police could lock down the area. No one knew for sure who he was, or why he had attacked the school. Some theories started floating around, but none of them made sense. The only sure thing was that our school was no longer a safe place. It was now a place where terror had taken hold, a terror that many of us still carry. The following weeks were a blur of interviews, therapy sessions, and attempts to return to normal. The school reopened, but it was never the same. Eventually, it was discovered that the man I had seen was a former student. He had attended the school over a decade ago, and, unfortunately, we'll never know what went through his mind. By the time he was found in another state, it was already too late. Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. Everything happened 3 years ago when I was attending a Catholic boarding school in Oregon. I'm not going to say which school, or even my name. The incident was completely covered up by the press, and the school has too much money and power for anyone to dare challenge them. The last thing I want is legal trouble, but I feel like I need to tell this story. Everything I'm about to share really happened. Even though it was 3 years ago, I can visualize every detail in my head like it was yesterday, and I can feel the fear as if it's happening right now. According to my therapist, that's what trauma does. For some people, the brain does everything it can to forget what happened, and over time, the details become blurry. For others, the obsession takes over, and the details are etched into the brain so deeply that it's almost impossible to erase them. I'm in that second group. The school was basically a gilded prison for a bunch of rich, spoiled kids, most of whom were troubled, sent there by parents who didn't know what else to do with them. These were kids raised in cold homes where money was the solution to every problem. When they were opposed, they reacted with a dangerous arrogance, as if the world belonged to them. But deep down, they were broken children. I, on the other hand, grew up in a completely different way. My parents were poor, and I spent most of my life in deplorable public schools, where social survival was a given. When I was 13, my parents died in a car accident, and I was put under the guardianship of my godparents. They were distant people and only took responsibility because it looked good in the eyes of the community. They had plenty of money but no desire to take care of me, so they decided to send me to this boarding school. I never managed to fit in with the other students. We didn't share the same stories, interests, or fears. I was the odd one out, the orphan under the wings of charity, and that made me an easy target. But instead of trying to fit in, I started to observe. My distraction became studying others and understanding the dynamics of that suffocating place. Over time, I realized that the school was a grenade ready to explode. The first day of the new school year brought a new teacher. She was young, energetic, and determined, clearly unprepared to deal with the beasts she had in front of her. The students, especially the more rebellious ones, were immediately attracted to the idea of breaking her, like a new toy they wanted to see shattered. They made bets on how long she would last. But the teacher surprised everyone. Not only did she refuse to give in, but she also responded with a wit that no one expected. She wasn't perfect, but she was brave. The worst of the students, a boy who embodied all the rot of that elite youth, decided she was too much. After a public humiliation where the teacher left him speechless, he was vulnerable for the first time. And I, unable to contain myself, laughed. The sound echoed through the room, and he looked at me with a burning hatred. The moment was brief, but enough for him to decide he needed to restore his position. Revenge would be inevitable. 2 days later, I was alone in the locker room, taking a shower. It was late afternoon, and the place was empty, the sound of water hitting the floor and the echo of my own breathing. That's when I heard hurried footsteps and someone trying to force the door open. Moments later, the school alarm went off. A lockdown alarm. Something that only went off in real emergencies. Panic took over me. I knew who was on the other side of the door. I knew it was him, and he had come for me. The lights suddenly went out, plunging the locker room into oppressive darkness. I heard his footsteps moving away, and for a brief moment, I thought the alarm had scared him off. But peeking through the window in the door, I saw him at the end of the corridor, determined, with a knife in his hand. He had realized time was short, and he had to act fast if he wanted to catch me. I ran through the locker room looking for an exit, anything I could use to defend myself. I was trapped, stuck in a labyrinth that, until then, was familiar and safe, but in that moment, felt like a trap. The phone rang suddenly, the shrill sound startling me. It was the school principal. His voice was grave and hurried. He explained that the police were on their way and that I should hide. Under no circumstances should I try to confront him. I kept running, each step more desperate than the last. There was nowhere to hide except in the lockers. They were big, but I wasn't sure if they were big enough to hold me. I chose locker number 34, squeezing myself inside just as I heard him break the glass to enter the locker room. I pressed myself against the cold metal of the locker, trying to control my breathing. He was inside, but he hadn't said a word. I started hearing the lockers being opened, one by one, the metallic sound echoing like a clock ticking down the time I had left. I felt like I was going to faint. The adrenaline was so intense that my body couldn't handle it. I blacked out. I woke up in an ambulance, confused and with blurry vision. The first thing I did was pinch myself, trying to figure out if I was alive or dead. The police had arrived seconds before he found me. The last thing I heard before passing out was the sound of sirens, a sound I will never forget. Since then, I've been in therapy, trying to deal with the stress. But the truth is, 3 years later, nothing has worked. What happened that night still haunts me, and the memories come back every time I close my eyes. Trauma is a parasite that eats away at me from the inside. And the only thing I have left is to share this story with more people than just my therapist, hoping to find others who've been through similar traumas. Maybe then I can find some peace.